This is Felix, your average middle-class citizen from Hong Kong. He works hard, cares about his community, and is generally an upstanding member of society. As a result of his dedication to his community, Felix wants to become a public servant and represent his community in the policy-making decisions of his home. He knows the government in Beijing has recently imposed election reforms in Hong Kong, and feels intimidated when he hears members of the Chinese Communist Party calling for Hong Kong to be exclusively represented by Chinese patriots. Despite this, he remains determined to find a way into public service. Unlike his contemporaries on the mainland, Felix lives in Hong Kong, where the right to vote and stand for election is guaranteed by his constitution. So is it as simple as running for office in his local constituency? This option is in fact open to Felix. 20 of the 90 seats in the Hong Kong legislature are elected by Hong Kong voters, so Felix could stand for election in one of these constituencies. But it's more complicated than just that. First of all, Felix needs to be nominated by 100 citizens in his district and 2 members of the election committee. What is the election committee, you may ask? That's a topic we'll touch on later, but for now, it's a 1,500-member council that manages elections in Hong Kong and is greatly influenced by the mainland Chinese Communist Party. So, to even run in the first place, Felix will have to become or already be well connected with the established political elite in Hong Kong. Even if he does manage to do this, he has to consider whether or not he even wants to run at all. You see, Hong Kong uses an interesting electoral system. The country is divided into 10 geographic constituencies, each sending 2 representatives to the council. The 2 members with the most votes wins. Seems simple enough and fair, right? You see, the problem with this system is voters are required to strategically divide their vote if they want both of the seats in their constituency to agree with them. For example, if 70% of the voters in a district are pro-democracy, and they want to vote in 2 pro-democracy candidates, they need to strategically divide their vote between 2 candidates on election day. If they fail to do this efficiently, with only 30% of the vote, a pro-Beijing candidate can secure half of the representative power. If Felix introduces himself into this equation, he may only complicate things further and destroy the fine balance that's already hard enough to achieve. Okay, fine. Maybe being directly elected is too difficult, but that system only constitutes 20 of the 90 seats in the Legislative Council. How are the other 70 members chosen, and how can Felix secure one of these seats? Well, Felix could run in a so-called trade-based constituency, which constitute 30 more seats in the council and represent business interests in Hong Kong. There is a seat on the council for several of the special administrative region's major trades, including a seat representing education, a fisheries seat, and several broad industry seats. To run for a seat representing one of these constituencies, Felix will need to be nominated by 10 members of that trade and again 2 members of the election committee. So it would be helpful to actually be a part of that trade, limiting Felix to the single seat representing whatever his profession is. If Felix manages to secure this nomination, he will now face one of the strangest electoral systems in the world. If he is not running in one of the 8 constituencies that let all of the individual members of that industry vote, he will be elected by so-called corporate voters. These corporate voters are not people, but the votes of individual business entities in their respective industry. Yep, that's right. Many of these seats are not elected by people, but rather by established businesses. Just like voters, businesses in a trade constituency need to register and cast a ballot for a single candidate. The candidate with the most votes from these businesses wins. This leads to strange election results, where in a country of millions, only a few hundred votes are cast for a politician that has equal power to a person who represents hundreds of thousands. So, if Felix ran for a seat in one of the industrial constituencies, he would be competing for the votes of various industrial corporations and businesses operating in Hong Kong, not the individual workers in these corporations. If he wants to secure this seat, he will have to appease business interests and preferably be connected to top business leaders in that sector. If that proves too daunting a task for Felix, what about the other 40 seats we haven't talked about yet? Well, the rest of those are directly elected by the election committee. Each of the 1,500 members of the election committee votes for 40 people on a secret ballot, and the people with the most votes win a seat on the Legislative Council. To have his name on this ballot, Felix would again need to be nominated by 2 members of the election committee, but each of them are only allowed to nominate a single person, so Felix would have to be well connected in the council itself to ever have a hope of being even nominated. Similarly, if Felix wanted to skip the entire process and achieve the highest office in Hong Kong to become the chief executive, he would need to be elected and nominated by the election committee itself. If he somehow managed to do this, he would then need to convince half of the existing election committee to vote him into office. This would not be easy and require years of political connections, experience, and likely proof of loyalty to the government in Beijing. Well, this election committee clearly has a lot of influence over elections and seems to be the deciding factor in a lot of the politics in Hong Kong, so maybe Fuchs can get on the committee instead. It has 1,500 members after all. That's a lot of seats that need to be filled. Similar to the Legislative Council, there are several ways for Felix to get a seat on the committee, but none of them are that direct. The election committee is divided into 5 large sectors, each sending 300 representatives to the committee. The first of these sectors is the industrial, commerce, and financial sector. This sector is broken up into different corporate voting blocks representing specific industries, much like the functional trade constituencies in the Legislative Council, though with the addition of 15 seats being reserved for small to medium enterprises. Again, if Felix wants to be appointed via this method, he will need to be a powerful person in his profession's industry and well connected. The second sector, called the professions, works much the same as the first, being divided into different subsectors ranging from Chinese medicine to accountancy. The same corporate voting rules apply, with a few exceptions and special rules. For example, the technology and innovation subsectors make 15 of its representatives members of the Chinese Academy of Sciences and the Chinese Academy of Engineering in Beijing. The Chinese medicine, accountancy, sports performing, arts, culture, and legal sectors similarly have to have a certain number of their representatives be from mainland Chinese organizations. The third sector is the grassroots, labor, religious, and other sector. These members are elected similarly to the first sector, but represent more common interest, assigning each of its 5 subsectors 60 representatives to the election committee. The third sector is likely Felix's most likely route to political office in Hong Kong. He would need to become some kind of community leader and be well connected to other community leaders who could help to get him elected. The fourth sector is made up of various representatives from the Hong Kong government, including all 90 members of the current Legislative Council, 156 representatives from the Hong Kong law enforcement agencies, and 27 representatives from mainland Hong Kong associations. Overall, this sector strongly represents the status quo and gives a large amount of power to law enforcement agencies, who tend to do the bidding of Beijing. Finally, the fifth sector sends the election committee 190 members from the National People's Congress and 110 members from, quote, relevant national organizations, which includes more members from law enforcement and emergency services. This sector is extremely pro-Beijing, 190 members of this bloc representing the National People's Congress, while the other 110 are sent from more pro-Beijing elements of Hong Kong government. So, ultimately, for Felix to get on the election committee, he needs to be well connected in government, business, or a narrow interest group in Hong Kong for him to have a chance to get on the election committee in any way. By now, Felix is likely noticing a disheartening pattern. The electoral process in Hong Kong is extremely Byzantine and seems to do its best to keep as many citizens as disengaged from politics as it can. Hong Kong has had a similar system to this since British rule, but since earlier in 2021, the Chinese Communist Party have only made it worse by adding the seats appointed by the election committee and nearly having the power of directly elected officials. Even if Felix dedicated enough time to connecting himself to political parties or business interests to hold political office anywhere in government, he would be facing an overwhelming bias of undemocratic interests and oversight from the mainland Communist Party, not to mention the fact he would likely owe significant political favors to the individuals who helped thrust him into office.